There are four things that quietly dismantle a narcissist's confidence more thoroughly than any argument, any confrontation, any perfectly worded final text ever could. And here's what makes them so unusual, so different from every tactic you might have already tried. You don't have to do any of them on purpose. You don't have to plan them, execute them, or even think about the narcissist while they're happening. They occur simply as the natural byproduct of you living your life, healing at your own pace, and moving forward, which is exactly what makes them so much more powerful than anything designed to hurt someone deliberately ever could be. Let's be clear about what this video actually is before we go further, because it matters. This isn't a revenge plan. It isn't a set of tactics engineered to make someone suffer. If you're looking for that, I want to be honest with you, it doesn't actually work, and chasing it keeps you tethered to someone you're trying to be free of. What we're about to walk through is something different and, in the long run, far more effective. An explanation of what actually happens to a narcissist's fragile internal architecture when four very specific, very natural things occur. None of them require your involvement, your effort, or your continued attention. All four of them are simply what happens when you stop performing a role in someone else's story and start living your own. The first thing, your indifference. Not performed coldness, not the silent treatment weaponized as a strategy, because that's still, underneath the surface, a form of engagement. A message being sent, even through silence, with the hope that it lands a certain way. What actually dismantles a narcissist is something quieter and much harder to fake. The moment your emotional reactivity to them genuinely, structurally disappears. Not because you're trying to prove a point, because you've done the internal work of releasing the need for anything from them at all. Here's why this specific thing matters so much more than anger, more than tears, more than the most devastating confrontation you could construct. We've talked before about how a narcissist's sense of self is regulated externally, dependent on a continuous stream of attention and emotional reaction from the people around them to feel coherent and stable. Every relationship in this framework functions as an ongoing transaction. You provide the emotional charge, anger, hurt, longing, even hatred, and in exchange they receive confirmation that they still matter, that their presence in your life still produces something significant. This transaction is remarkably durable. It survives fights, it survives breakups, it survives years of distance, as long as some emotional charge is still flowing in their direction. Genuine indifference breaks the transaction completely. And it does so in a way nothing else can, because a narcissist has an entire toolkit built specifically to handle every other response you might offer. Anger gets reframed as your instability. Hurt gets used as leverage for guilt. Even hatred, in its own strange way, confirms you're still deeply invested. What they don't have a toolkit for is genuine irrelevance. The specific, disorienting experience of realizing that your emotional state no longer references them at all. There's nothing to manipulate in indifference, because manipulation requires something to work with, some thread of investment to pull on. When that thread is genuinely gone, not performed as gone, but actually structurally absent, the narcissist is left facing something their psychology was never built to withstand directly. Total irrelevance to the emotional world of someone who used to organize their entire inner life around managing that relationship. This is worth understanding at a deeper level because it explains why so many narcissists resurface, seemingly out of nowhere, at the exact moment someone's indifference becomes real rather than performed. It isn't coincidence, and it isn't some mystical sixth sense. It's a direct, predictable response to a regulatory system suddenly losing a source it had unconsciously come to depend on. The confidence that felt so solid throughout the relationship was never actually as internally generated as it appeared. It required your engagement to sustain itself, and once that engagement genuinely disappears, the confidence doesn't have anywhere left to draw from. The second thing, you thriving visibly without their involvement. This one is worth separating from indifference specifically because it operates through a slightly different mechanism, even though the two often develop together. Indifference is about your internal emotional state, no longer referencing them. Visible thriving is about the external evidence of your life continuing to build and flourish in ways that have nothing to do with them. A new job, new friendships, a level of peace and stability that becomes obvious to anyone who knew you during the relationship and is now watching you from a distance afterward. Here's why this specific thing lands so hard, and it connects to something we've discussed in earlier videos about how a narcissist's entire relationship with you functioned underneath the surface as an extended performance of a particular story, one where you were, in some version or another, difficult, unstable, too sensitive, or simply not capable of appreciating what they offered. That story required a specific kind of confirmation to remain believable, both to the people around them and, just as importantly, to themselves. If you were genuinely the unstable one, the story predicted a particular outcome after the relationship ended. Continued struggle, continued dysfunction, a visible confirmation that the narcissist's frustration throughout the relationship had been reasonable all along. Your thriving directly contradicts that prediction, and it does so in a way that's almost impossible for them to successfully argue against, because it isn't an argument. It's simply visible reality. You laughing easily at a gathering mutual friends also attended. You building a career that clearly doesn't require anyone's management or approval. You appearing calm, grounded, and clearly at peace in photos and conversations relayed back through people who still have contact with both of you. None of this requires you to say a single word about the relationship or defend yourself against anything that was said about you. Your wellness itself becomes the evidence, circulating quietly through every room you occupy, undermining a narrative that depended on you falling apart in order to remain credible. This is worth understanding as something that operates almost entirely outside your control or awareness, which is precisely what makes it so much more effective than anything deliberately engineered could be. You're not thriving in order to prove a point to them. You're thriving because you're finally free to, because the enormous amount of energy that used to go into managing their emotional state and protecting their reputation is now available for building something of your own. The byproduct of that freedom, genuine, visible wellness, happens to be one of the most destabilizing things a narcissist can witness, precisely because it was never engineered to be destabilizing in the first place. It's simply what happens when a person who was carrying an enormous invisible weight finally sets it down. There's a specific reason this particular kind of evidence is so much harder for a narcissist to successfully argue away than almost any other kind of confrontation you could offer. Direct confrontation, no matter how accurate or well articulated, still requires them to engage with you, to construct a counter-narrative, to defend a position, and defending a position, however uncomfortable, is still a form of engagement they know how to perform. Visible thriving that requires nothing from you doesn't give them anything to engage with at all. There's no argument to construct against a photo of you laughing at a friend's wedding, no counter-narrative that successfully explains away a promotion you earned entirely on your own, no clever reframing available for the simple, undeniable fact of a life that looks from every external angle more stable and more genuinely happy than it did when they were still in it. This is also why so many narcissists develop a strange, persistent preoccupation with checking on an ex's life from a distance, long after the relationship has ended and long after they've told everyone, including themselves, that they've moved on completely. It isn't romantic longing in the way it might appear. It's a kind of compulsive information gathering driven by the same underlying need that drove the original relationship, a need to confirm one way or another whether the story they've constructed about what happened is still holding up against reality. Every piece of evidence that it isn't holding up, every photo, every mutual friend's offhand comment about how well you seem to be doing, adds a small cumulative crack to a narrative that was never built to withstand sustained contact with the truth. The third thing, other people seeing clearly. This is perhaps the most quietly devastating of the four, because unlike the first two, it doesn't even require your direct participation at all. It happens entirely through the natural, gradual process of the people around a narcissist accumulating enough independent evidence over enough time to start noticing a pattern that was previously obscured, often specifically because you spent years unintentionally obscuring it yourself, absorbing friction before it ever reached anyone else, translating outbursts into something forgivable, managing a reputation that was never fairly yours to manage in the first place. Here's what actually happens once that management stops. And it's worth understanding in detail because it explains a process that unfolds slowly enough that a narcissist rarely notices it happening until it's already well underway. Throughout the relationship, you were functioning as an informal filter between the narcissist's actual behavior and the outside world's perception of them. Every time you made an excuse to a friend who witnessed something troubling, they're just stressed. They didn't mean it that way. You were performing invisible reputation management, work so consistent and so automatic that neither you nor anyone else likely ever named it explicitly as a job you were doing. When that filtering stops, either because you're no longer in the relationship or because you finally stopped absorbing consequences that were never yours to absorb, the narcissist's actual behavior becomes visible to people who used to only ever see the curated version. This visibility compounds in ways that are worth understanding specifically. Friends who used to hear a softened, explained-away version of an outburst start witnessing the outburst directly, without your interpretation smoothing its edges. Family members who used to extend automatic benefit of the doubt because you always seemed to vouch for the relationship start asking harder questions, especially once new information arrives that doesn't fit the story they'd been told. And perhaps most significantly, if a new relationship enters the picture, the same patterns that took years to become undeniable to you often become visible to a new partner and their circle in a fraction of that time, simply because there's no equivalent management system in place to slow the process down. Younger people entering relationships today, in particular, tend to have far more cultural awareness of manipulation patterns than previous generations did, meaning warning signs that once took years to recognize now sometimes surface in a matter of months. What this produces over time is something a narcissist has almost no effective strategy against: a slow, cumulative shift in how the people around them actually perceive them, occurring largely outside their control and often without their full awareness that it's even happening. Charm, their most reliable tool throughout their entire life, works exceptionally well on people meeting them for the first time, or people who've only ever seen the curated version. It works much less reliably on people who've now witnessed the pattern directly, repeatedly, without an intermediary softening what they're seeing. This shift rarely announces itself as a single dramatic confrontation. It shows up in smaller, cumulative ways: a friend who used to text daily who now responds more slowly and less warmly, a family gathering that feels subtly colder than it used to, an invitation that quietly stops arriving. None of it explained directly because most people understandably don't want the conflict of confronting someone about a pattern they've noticed. They simply gradually withdraw. This is worth naming clearly because it's easy to assume a narcissist doesn't notice or care about this kind of gradual social erosion, given how much effort goes into performing unbothered confidence. In reality, this erosion tends to matter enormously to them, precisely because their entire sense of self depends on external perception in a way most people's doesn't. A narcissist watching their social capital quietly decline, watching invitations dwindle, watching the warmth in a room shift even slightly when they walk in. This registers as a genuine, significant threat, even when it's never discussed directly, even when the narcissist themselves would never fully admit to noticing or caring about it. The fourth thing, time passing without you. This might be the simplest of the four to explain and also the hardest to fully understand until you've lived through enough of it yourself to see its effects clearly. Time simply continuing to pass, with you genuinely absent from a narcissist's life, does something to their internal experience that almost nothing else can replicate. It removes the possibility of return becoming easier the longer it's delayed, while simultaneously making the specific accumulated trust you once provided harder and harder to replicate with anyone new. Here's why this matters more than it might initially seem to. Every relationship a narcissist builds after you requires starting from zero in terms of accumulated trust, accumulated understanding of their specific patterns, accumulated willingness to extend patience past the point most people would offer it. This kind of trust, the kind you built over years of navigating the relationship's specific difficulties, doesn't transfer to someone new just because enough time has passed for them to want it to. It has to be rebuilt, slowly, from the beginning, with someone who doesn't yet have your particular history of learning exactly which behaviors to forgive and which patterns to work around. As time passes and this rebuilding proves harder than expected, sometimes failing entirely, sometimes succeeding only temporarily before collapsing under the same pressures that ended things with you, something significant happens to how the narcissist experiences the passage of time itself. Rather than time healing the rupture the way it might for someone with a more stable, internally regulated sense of self, time instead tends to deepen an unprocessed, often unnamed sense of loss. Not necessarily loss of you specifically, since we've established that the attachment was functional rather than deeply personal in the way yours likely was, but loss of the specific, calibrated version of stability you once provided, a stability that gets harder to replicate, not easier, the longer it remains unreplaced. This is worth understanding as one of the most permanent, unglamorous forms of consequence a narcissist experiences after a significant relationship ends, not a single dramatic reckoning, not a clean moment of realization, but a slow, compounding awareness, growing quieter but more persistent with each passing month, that whatever comes next simply isn't working the way the old arrangement did. This awareness rarely gets acknowledged directly, and it almost never produces the kind of genuine accountability an empath might hope for after everything she went through. But it accumulates nonetheless, in the background of every subsequent relationship. Every unexplained restlessness, every moment of comparison the narcissist will never admit to making, even to themselves. Now here's where all four of these things converge into something worth understanding clearly, because taken individually, each one might seem like a modest, slow-moving form of consequence. Nothing dramatic enough to feel like the reckoning you might once have hoped for. But taken together, compounding on top of each other over months and years, they produce something far more thorough and far more permanent than any single confrontation ever could. Your indifference removes the emotional charge that used to sustain the relationship's underlying transaction. Your visible thriving contradicts the story that required you to struggle in order to remain credible. Other people seeing clearly erodes the social capital that made the narcissist's charm so effective in the first place. And time, simply continuing to pass, deepens the gap between what they once had and what proves genuinely difficult to rebuild with anyone new. None of these four things were engineered by you as tactics. That's worth repeating, because it's the entire point of understanding them this way, rather than as a revenge strategy. You didn't design your indifference to hurt them. You built it because continuing to feel enraged or heartbroken was costing you pieces of yourself you needed back. You didn't build your thriving to prove a point. You built it because you were finally free to invest your energy into your own life instead of managing someone else's emotional state. You didn't orchestrate other people seeing clearly. You simply stopped doing the invisible labor of protecting a reputation that was never fairly yours to protect, and the natural consequence of that stopping unfolded on its own, without your involvement. And you certainly didn't control the passage of time. It simply happened the way it happens for everyone, indifferent to what either of you might have wanted from it. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth sitting with directly, because it changes what you're actually meant to do with this information. If these four things were tactics, the natural next step would be to actively pursue them harder, check whether your indifference is landing, curate your thriving specifically for an audience that includes them, actively work to influence how other people perceive them, count down the days until enough time has passed to matter. All of that would actually undermine the very things we've just described, because it would reintroduce exactly the kind of engagement that gives a narcissist something to work with, something to respond to, something that proves you're still, on some level, performing for their benefit rather than simply living your life. The actual instruction, if there is one, is almost the opposite of pursuit. Let these four things happen as the natural consequence of healing rather than as goals you're actively working toward. Focus on the indifference, not because it will hurt them, but because releasing the need for anything from them is genuinely, structurally better for you, regardless of what it does on their end. Focus on your own thriving, not because it proves something to an audience that includes your ex, but because building a life that has nothing to do with them is the actual complete point of everything you're doing. Let other people see what they see without needing to influence or accelerate that process, because your energy is far better spent building your own relationships than managing anyone's perception of someone you're no longer accountable for. And let time simply pass without counting it, without measuring whether enough has gone by yet to constitute a satisfying consequence, because time was never actually working on your behalf specifically. It's simply doing what it always does to everyone, regardless of what any of us hope it will eventually deliver.